Hi, my name is Nanis Asher, and I'm the Portfolio Brand Ambassador for Beam Suntory. So, today we're going to talk about Sipsmith Gin. This is the beautiful masterclass that I'm going to try and put on for you guys. And it's literally about one of my favorite gins of all time. This London Dry legend. But before we jump into the London Dry legend to my right here, I want to talk about gin as a category. I want to talk about how we got to the point that we're at today. I'm not going to go too far back, but I'm going to start at a specific moment because Sipsmith and the master distillers did something pretty spectacular that has influenced gin and will influence gin for the rest of its lifespan. Let's go back in time to the 1600s when William Orange sat on the British throne. He sat there and he ruled, enjoyed his lifestyle, but there was one thing that William Orange disliked, and it was the French. They were his chief rival. But his subjects in the UK were drinking French brandies, aka cognacs. They were drinking French wine. And William Orange sat there and said, why are these guys contributing to my rival's economy? So he did something unprecedented at the time. And he said, as long as you're a subject of Britain, you can make Genever in your house. Kind of crazy. Imagine walking down the hallway of your apartment building and every fourth door, somebody's making gin. I feel like that would be an incredible party. So, Genever was what we started with. And if you don't know what Genever is a juniper-based malt wine spirit. So think of it as a hybrid of whiskey, because of the malt, and gin, because of the juniper. And it's delicious. You can still find some incredible Genevers on the market today. But Genever was the national spirit of Holland. And that's where the production of gin stemmed from. So every fourth house could make Genever, but not everyone knew how to make Genever. And eventually, they started throwing in different styles of botanicals. But one thing was for sure, everyone was making it in small batches. Because if you're making it in your house, you're not exactly going to have a giant still unless you are that guy. You got those dollars. But anyways, after some time, you had the chief industries in the UK at the time, mainly beer and tea, looking at gin and saying, well, those guys are taking away from our business here. We're not going to stand for this anymore. And they started to commission different artists to paint a depiction of society after the ruins of gin. There were stories that were circulated. One of those stories was about a mother who sold her daughter's clothing so that she could buy gin. Yeah, Child Protection Services didn't exactly come around at that time, so we have no idea if this is based in fact, but it actually started to serve its purpose. And the government started to put on regulations to all people who are making distillation and basically eradicated small batch gins in London. So before we proceed with the rest of that tale, let's talk about what gin is. First of all, gin can be made anywhere. So if you and we meet up next week and we want to make a gin, giddy up, man. Give me a shout, let's do it. We can make it right here. We can make it in any country you can think of. Because gin is a juniper-based spirit that is distilled with a group of botanicals and then later cut with distilled water. What's a botanical? Botanical is any part of a plant or a root that undergoes photosynthesis. Without getting too technical, photosynthesis is when the sun shines down and gives food to those plants. That's how plants grow. They get that solar energy, kind of like Superman. Botanicals can be any source. And when I say any botanical, whether it's a root, it could be a leaf from a flower, it could be a petal, it could be a stem, could be the roots of that flower, could be any aspect. Because when you treat those roots and those parts of the plant, as long as they're not poisonous, there's flavor that can be extracted from all those botanicals. Now, there are different styles of gin as well, but the style we're going to be talking about today is the London Dry style. And London Dry means that you take all the botanicals that you've chosen and you let those botanicals sit in a bath of neutral grain spirit. Neutral grain spirit, if you want to make this easy, basically a vodka. So once those botanicals sit in that neutral grain spirit, you got to start cooking them. Because how do you get flavor in anything? You start cooking. There are a couple different ways you can extract that flavor. One, you let those botanicals sit in the neutral grain overnight, right? So we're talking 15 hours, 16 hours. And just like with tea, all the oils and natural flavors from the botanicals are going to seep down into the neutral grain and change its composition. So you can do that, or you can just get your neutral grain, put your botanicals in, ready for the still, switch on your still and let it run. The other way, which is limited to a few different gin companies, is they take the botanicals and they put it in a basket. And if you understand distillation without me having to go too deep into the process, alcohol is separated by water based on the temperature that it hits. And the vapors, basically the alcohol will change its state and become vapor, which rises to the top of the still, cools down rapidly, and becomes liquid once more. Those vapors will rise through that basket and extract all the flavor from it. So that's another unique way of doing it. But London Dry isn't gin made in London. London Dry is a style where you distill every botanical in the first distillation and you don't add anything afterwards. Okay? Make sense? Good. If it doesn't make sense, drop me an email, follow me on Instagram, whatever you gotta do, I'm here to help. So we've talked about botanicals, what they're limited to. Typical gin botanicals you'll find: cinnamon, caraway, juniper of course, because it's not a gin without that, but different citrus peels, right? So now that you're thinking about all these different spices and herbs and fruits and vegetables in some cases that are used for gin, realize that they all have different boiling points. They all have different flavor profiles. They all have different compositions. So when you're putting your gin profile together, you're putting it together with an end product in mind, almost like you're building a cocktail. If you're making an old fashioned, you need some sugar, you need some bitters, and you need your spirit. Each of those components are gonna impart a different flavor that comes together to make something that is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So anise in gin will give you sweetness, for example. There's no sugar added. Cinnamon also gives a little bit of sweetness. But then you also have citrus, which gives that fresh quality. Speaking of fresh, different styles of gin that you might taste, you might get some floral gins. So gins that focus more on the spices or peppers. Gins that focus more on the citrus. And each of those styles of gin will give you different proponents in your cocktails. So the world of gin is huge, it's massive, and it gives you so much creativity that you can use in your drinks and even in your food pairings. So it's really up to you what you choose to do with all your cocktails, but what's important is to find a gin, one style of gin that ticks all the boxes. And I may or may not be talking about this guy. So, let's talk about the elimination of the small batch category in London. They did it for the good of society. Because at the end of the day, they believed that people were consuming way too much. They believed that people were ruining their families. One of gin's nicknames is the mother's ruin. So they said, let's put this category in the hands of people that are serious about making gins. And for 200 years, that was the case. Until you had two childhood friends, Sam Galsworthy and Fairfax Hall. They were working regular jobs, and I think a lot of us out there, we have our regular jobs that we work, but some of us have other dreams. We're working some jobs because at the end of the day, that's what's paying our bills. But these two men sat down and they talked every day and basically had a big passion for gin and realized that on the market, a lot of these gins were created for mass production. They weren't created with this. They wanted to create something that would speak to all kinds of different people. They wanted something that was handcrafted, but made in small batches, the way that they used to. So they decided to leave their jobs and create gin, which was a big risk at the time because only a few short years later, there'd be a big economic recession, not only in the UK, but the world. So you had these two men with passion, and when you hear them speak today, that passion just emanates from them. But they needed someone else who had just as much passion, if not more, to create the gin. Someone who had distinctive knowledge about the history of gin making and how to make the best. Enter Jared Brown, cocktail legend, knowledge legend. This man has distilled spirits all over Europe. He's created the Cocktail History Museum with the king of cocktails, Dale DeGroff. And he's an all-around gent. When you see this guy, there isn't even a shadow of a doubt that he's a legend. So the three of them got together and they did extensive research about what qualities produced the best gin in the entire world back in the golden era of gin production. And there were three that they settled on. One, it had to be small batch. Had to be. It's the difference between a giant corporation and a mom and pop shop. Also, it had to be distilled in copper, because when it comes down to copper and the distillation process, through a chemical reaction, copper removes impurities from the gin. It also removes impurities from any spirit that you're running through there, but it removes it from the gin, so it makes it smooth and clean and crisp. The other was distilling it through something called one-shot distillation. And for me, this is what separates Sipsmith from every other gin brand out there. Most massive brands are producing something called gin concentrate. So they will take more botanicals than is needed, 10 times the botanicals, 20 times, however big their production is, and they'll produce something called a concentrate, which is equivalent to a syrup. So for every 750 milliliters in a bottle that you'll find, there will be 20 milliliters of botanical distilled concentrate. So the rest will be neutral grain spirit. So they'll add that concentrate in and they'll basically let that infuse. But the problem is it's not a harmonious distillation. It's like cooking two separate parts of a stew completely in different pots. Jared, Fairfax, and Sam also added one other crucial element, making sure that the gin is heart cut by hand. It's up to the senses of the distiller to know when the gin is ready. No machinery is involved, which if you fully understand the process of distillation, like I know some of you do, that's no small task. It's a beautiful process. It is as handcrafted as it possibly gets. And it's something that would be extremely difficult to achieve if you had a massive scale operation. It truly sets Sipsmith apart. So let's go over that again. Small batch distillation in copper stills to remove impurities, and then heart cut by hand, and finally, one-shot distillation. There aren't many companies out there doing that one-shot distillation. So you have a harmonious blend, heart cut by hand, free of all impurities. What is the profile of Sipsmith Gin? Number one thing I want you guys to take home is the fact that the satiation point of Sipsmith Gin is 100%. And satiation point refers to the first sip being as delicious and mouth-watering as the last sip. Keep that in mind when you're building your cocktails. Very, very key point to distinguish. But with Sipsmith Gin, you will get zesty citrus, spices emerging, and a truly mouth-watering mouthfeel. Those three elements produce a gin that is versatile in any cocktail you want to make. If you want to make a Negroni, have at her, sir. Because that gin that's standing right in front of me is going to stand up in that Negroni. You want to make a martini? Have at her, sis. Yes, sister, make that martini. Because then you'll get the core essence of the gin. It's not light and delicate, so you don't have to worry about overstirring. You don't have to worry too much about adding citrus zest and shaking too hard, because the gin will always stand up. You'll always detect the gin in any cocktail you make. Speaking of cocktails, I think it's about time I have one. So I'm going to make a couple of cocktails, and I'm going to dedicate these cocktails to Sam, Fairfax, and Jared. Because at the end of the day, we have so many gins in the market, and the category just continues to grow because the production of gin is only limited to the botanicals that you can find in your neighborhood. Maybe your neighborhood's the Amazon rainforest, which means you have botanicals for days. So thanks to Jared, Sam, and Fairfax, lobbying the government for 2 years to get that distiller's license to the specifications they needed, the small batch craft category exists. Yes, the next two cocktails are going to be very, very simple, but it's my belief, and also Jared Brown's belief, which you'll find a lot of the recipes for great cocktails in this book, that cocktails do not need to be complicated when you have an uncompromising gin. So let's get started. So let's get these drinks made. So we're gonna start with the martini, because I think when it comes down to gin, one of the best cocktails to truly understand your gin and know your gin is the martini. We're gonna make this martini, and this will be in honor of the uncompromising gin, and also in honor of this book that was put together by Jared Brown. Basically, it's 100 gin cocktails with 3 ingredients or less. Because as I mentioned, cocktails don't have to be complicated when you have an uncompromising gin. So let's get started. You might notice I've got some ice in my glass, and for all you bartenders out there, you know exactly why. I'm gonna chill this glass down, give it a nice little stir. I've got nice big chunks of ice in there as well, because the ice is more pure. When it comes down to cocktails, ice is extremely important. The better your ice is, the better your cocktail. Boom. So I'm just gonna let that ice sit there for a little while and let it chill while I make the drink, because it doesn't need to change temperature right now. And when I deliver this to my guest, the cocktail is gonna be as crisp and fresh as possible. But I'm also gonna make sure that I empty out any excess water, because you don't want that extra dilution from the water. Perfect. Next up, let's get the least expensive ingredient into your cocktail first. You never want to start with the most expensive because if you make a mistake, your bar managers are going to be very angry if you end up throwing out a really premium product that is as precious as gold. So let's put in our vermouth, and I'm going to put in 10 milliliters of vermouth to make sure that the balance is nice. And I'm going to drizzle that all over that ice. So next up, I'm going to pour 50 milliliters of Sipsmith London Dry Gin. There we are. And of course, my friends, another important aspect is to stir. Since Sipsmith is a very robust gin, and when I say robust, you get that fresh citrus bursting out of there, you get spices bursting out of there. It's something that can stand up in any cocktail. But when it comes to martinis, you don't want to over stir, right? So I like to do about 20 revolutions, and that's about it. Keep it simple. So I'm going to empty out the ice. Get my strainer and pour. So now that I've strained, I'm gonna make sure to get a nice fresh lemon zest because I keep alluding to the citrus profile of the Sipsmith. I wanna enhance that. So I like to zest the lemon close to the glass because within the skin, you have the pith of the citrus. And in that pith, which is the white part, that's where all the oils and the flavor comes from. So by zesting near the glass, you're gonna have a nice spritz of citrus oils dusting over your glass. And when your guest starts to drink, they're gonna smell the citrus, which adds to the experience. So I'm gonna make a nice long zest of lemon. And I like to make sure that my garnish presentation looks really, really nice. So I'm just gonna add a little bit of extra zest because you can never have too much zest. And then do a nice twist. A little bit of an accordion here. And I'll just drop it in the glass. And there we have it. A nice uncompromising Sipsmith martini. So the gin tonic is gonna be next because, like I mentioned, I wanna keep the cocktails relatively simple, and I wanna make sure that these are cocktails that you're gonna be serving your guests. Everybody loves a gin tonic, but there are little things you can do to make sure your gin tonic hits right. And with an uncompromising gin, your gin tonics will never fail on the quality test. But if you don't have enough ice, if the temperature isn't correct, those are little things that are gonna take away from the gin and tonic itself. So, to begin, just like with the martini, let's get that glass cold. Let's just make sure that it's something you can actually hold on to, and the perception is that it's gonna be nice and refreshing, right? Because that's what people think of with the gin tonic. When they grab one, they say this is gonna be easy to drink and it's gonna be nice and refreshing. And the colder it is, the easier it will be to drink. Trust me, trust me. So when you see your glass and it's got a nice frost on the edges, that's when you know you're pretty much ready to go. But you also want to make sure that you get rid of any excess water. Perfect, no more water. So now we're gonna pour the gin, Sipsmith, of course. We're gonna make sure that you feel the gin a little more and you have a good experience drinking it. So I'm gonna put about 45 milliliters of gin. right here. Perfect. And try and get it over as many ice cubes as you can. And also, to make sure the gin drinking experience is perfect, use the best tonic you can. So a nice premium tonic should be the best way to go. Make sure it's nice and cold as well, so the effervescence, AKA the bubbles, are correct. And then for garnish, I like just a nice simple citrus garnish, but just like with gin and the fact that you've got so many botanicals all over the world, you can get creative. You can use different types of citrus, you can use fruit, you can use spices, you can use herbs. Sky's the limit really, but since the sky isn't the limit on my timing, we're just gonna use a nice simple garnish, and I want you guys to take it from there. Use your imaginations. So it's a nice citrus lime. Nice and clean, easy. No one will ever say a bad word about it. They'll only say good things when they sit at your bar. And there you have it. A nice Sipsmith gin tonic. Keyword uncompromising, if I haven't hammered it home enough. Enjoy. So thanks once again. We have a great lineup of different things we're going to be showing you with our brands, and also showing you different ways you can use our brands, whether it's with food, drink, cocktails, and all kinds of other things. So thank you, and I will see you at our next masterclass. Salud.